So tonight's this evening's lecture, will be on Bruno Latour and the philosophy of actors. And let me start by saying that Latour's very recent passing is a great loss for everyone interested in technology, ecology, politics, the sciences, and philosophy, because Latour spent decades writing at the cutting edge of all these domains, especially where they intersect. His work was, without doubt, a source of insight and inspiration for countless readers inside and outside the university. I certainly owe Latour a great intellectual debt, and I hope that this lecture will do some justice to his ideas. As the title of the talk indicates, my intention is to introduce Latour's ontology of actors and networks, yet in order to grasp the relevance of this theory, we must also understand what it seeks to replace or dethrone, and that is what Latour calls modern thinking. Additionally, the difference that Latour's philosophy can make is best demonstrated with concrete examples, and my example this evening will be Latour's own writings about ecology. Hence the tripartite structure of tonight's presentation: first, modernity; second, actors and networks; and finally, ecology. So modernity, what is it to be modern, and why should you care about whether or not you think you are modern? To be modern is to live in the wake of figures like Galileo, Descartes, and Kant. To be modern is to be shaped by societies that are products of the scientific and industrial revolutions. To be modern is to believe that the forces of science and technology promise us perpetual progress as we keep distancing ourselves from an archaic and superstitious past. And above all, Latour argues, to be modern is to think that the world consists of two and only two, well, it depends, ontologically separate domains: nature and culture. And if we look at nature and culture, then to modern eyes, these two domains consist of fundamentally different kinds of things, ontologically different kinds of entities. For the moderns, nature is the domain of passive, inert, and neutral objects. In and of itself, an object does not add anything new to the world. In this specific sense, it never acts, it merely behaves in predictable ways. A natural object is fully calculable and controllable in principle, if not in fact. A quintessential example of such an object is a billiard ball on an inclined plane, right? Given the relevant set of natural laws, the physical properties of the ball, and the angle of inclination, we can calculate exactly how the ball will move, how long it will take to reach the end of the plane, what the speed of the ball will be, and so on. So in this very simple setup, the calculation is possible because there are no outside variables in the hypothetical model. No outside variables that might unexpectedly alter the inclination of the plane or the properties of the ball, right? Moreover, the ball, in the example, has no chance whatsoever to generate a feedback loop that would change the conditions that make it do what it does, in this case, the relevant natural laws. And to be modern is to generalize this way of thinking about an object to all entities except sentient ones, except entities like us. In short, the moderns hold that nature is ultimately a mechanism, a terribly complex mechanism with countless moving parts, perhaps, maybe a mechanism that you can only calculate in probabilistic ways, but nevertheless a mechanism that is subject to principles that are reliable enough for it to be calculated and controlled. Crucially, as Latour would have it, the moderns like to think that this nature with a capital N operates completely separated from human experiences and actions. To think that the world is precisely as we experience it. To think that things in themselves are animated or even shaped by our thoughts and actions or to think that the world somehow correlates or resonates with human intentions, all that is precisely a pre-modern way of thinking. It is what the moderns are trying to escape, right? So they're trying to escape a world in which you believe that volcanoes erupt because people have sinned, or a world in which the weather is beautiful because the gods approve of a wedding that is happening on that day, or a world in which birds are flying in certain patterns and this constitutes an omen about upcoming war. The moderns want to leave such archaisms behind. Modern nature is therefore a realm unto itself, and its objects can only be known via the specialized procedures of the natural sciences. In this sense, modernity still operates on the schema provided by Plato's famous myth of the cave. Recall that according to the myth, we all spend our entire lives experiencing mere shadows, mere simulacra that do not constitute things in themselves. Only a lucky few can escape the cave and ascend via a narrow path to the real world, where they can finally acquire knowledge of what reality truly is, and then they have the terrifying job of going back into the cave and educating everyone into what reality is really like, even though nobody believes them. For Socrates, those privileged few are philosophers, but for the moderns, those privileged few are natural scientists. So that's nature, according to the moderns, according to Latour. The second domain posited by the moderns is that of culture. Culture does not consist of objects, but of us, of human subjects and our social relations. Unlike objects, subjects are creative and unpredictable, also irrational. We are freedom, as the existentialist philosophers would ultimately put it. So whereas the moderns take nature as something to be made increasingly known, they take culture as something to be made increasingly free. The modern aim is to let human beings determine who they are and how they coexist in terms of nothing but their own social relations. So just as nature must be separated from culture, culture must be purified from nature. Concretely, this does of course refer to how a house, building a house, decreases your exposure and vulnerability to heat and cold, to how a farm decreases your dependence on what grows in the wild, and to how medicine increases your vulnerability to disease, and so on. But none of those things are yet typically modern. Quintessentially modern is, for example, the idea that belief in God does not refer to a really existing entity out there, but only to ourselves, to our own subjectivity and social relations. Another typically modern idea is that human beings are not predefined or pre-formatted by some kind of natural essence, but rather define and redefine themselves in a historical and intersubjective process that is driven precisely by nothing but our own attempts to define ourselves. Right? That's basically the German idealist notion of Geist. So then we have nature and culture, these two great domains of modernity. And at stake in this worldview is what the moderns view as a double emancipation. First, nature. The left is always going to be nature. If I gesture in the air, the right is going to be culture. Nature must be freed from what we humans project onto it or read into it. And second, culture must be freed from the restrictions of nature. Not just in a material sense, but also in the sense of us acknowledging that our identities and mutual engagement are precisely social phenomena, not pre-formatted or demanded by nature. Now, it's important that for Latour, that schema is not just an abstract way of thinking, it is also the blueprint based on which we have built our entire modern, contemporary, industrialized, and so on world. Just think of how universities have faculties for the natural sciences on the one hand, and for the humanities and social sciences on the other hand. Or just think of how, for centuries now, we moderns, have overwhelmingly treated nature as nothing but a pile of resources to be studied and strip-mined, as if it would contain nothing that could ever cross the ontological gap, so to speak, and have real and tangible effects in the domain of culture. And based on that schema, Latour argues the moderns were able to conquer a world, to become a dominant force in the world. And there are at least three reasons for this unprecedented success on a conceptual level, let's say. I mean, of course, gunpowder and so on also helps. But on a conceptual level, first, the moderns do not think that they have real enemies in this world, because they take every other worldview to be an outdated and biased perspective that is still clouded by myth and superstition. Every statement about the natural world, let alone every complete worldview, that is not provided by the natural sciences is just a misguided error to them. Hence, when they encounter other peoples, the moderns give themselves moral license to assimilate them. And they do not see this as an act of destruction or aggression or oppression, but rather as an act of education and enlightenment. Second, the modern schema gives you license to innovate and produce on an unprecedented scale. Because of this modern split between nature and culture, the study and mastery of nature, meaning our use of science and technology, can largely be decoupled from its social, cultural consequences. Or perhaps more accurately put, that question about social consequences can always be postponed into the future. So the moderns can tell themselves that for now, they are just doing science or just designing this or that new technology, and that those acts, for now, merely bear upon nature and the domain of facts, not on culture and the domain of politics, right? Even today, there are still many scientists who take themselves to operate in a value-free way, so decoupled from culture, as if signaling rising sea levels or developing new antibiotics does not always already have a normative aspect. Conversely, when it comes to culture, the moderns unleashed an equal amount of creative force because they give human beings license to determine their existence among themselves. Meaning, without having to take into account supernatural or even just natural entities that would somehow place limits on what we choose to become or how we choose to coexist. Hence, we have industrialized an entire world in order to increase our own freedom and affluence before paying much attention to the ecological consequences of doing so. Third, and finally, Latour argues that the moderns are so extremely successful because they are precisely not doing what they say and think they are doing. And that's where we get to the exciting bits, namely to what is weird and ultimately wrong about the modern worldview. Because what do the moderns think they are doing? They think that they are engaged in what Latour calls the purification of the world. They are cleansing things in themselves from our biased perspectives on them, and they are freeing humanity from the domination of the things in this world. So they are trying to bring forth a world of pure objects and pure subjects. Or so they think. Because what are they actually doing? Well, according to Latour, they are ceaselessly creating hybrids. And a hybrid is precisely not a pure object or a pure subject. So what's a hybrid? Latour's most famous example, or at least his best example, is the hole in the ozone layer. Is the hole in the ozone layer a natural phenomenon? Yes, of course it is, because it concerns the chemical composition of the atmosphere, such as can be studied through the natural sciences. So of course it's natural. But is the hole in the ozone layer also a cultural phenomenon? Well, yes, of course it is, because it is only shaped as it is because of the emission of gases from refrigerators and spray cans. And the existence of those objects is in turn shaped by our industries, our legal systems, our economies, our fashions, and our consumption patterns. So, if you ask why the hole in the ozone layer is what it is and not something else, it is neither a pure object of nature nor a pure artifact of culture. Crucially, it is not even a hybrid of nature and culture. This is because nature, with a capital N, and culture with a capital C, are of course not really existing entities, in the same way that my pen or my body is a really existing entity. To think that there is a thing called nature or culture that exerts some kind of control over other entities is to commit a category mistake. It is to mistakenly attribute agency to something that is just shorthand, to what is just a name for a vast network of individual entities, in this case molecules, laws, refrigerators, trade agreements, consumers, and many others that collectively determine the hole in the ozone layer as having this rather than that specific composition. So when Latour talks about hybrids, he doesn't mean combinations of nature and culture, he means a product of heterogeneous casts of other entities. And what's true for the hole in the ozone layer, he argues, is true for every other entity that you can conceive as well. And what the moderns have been doing during the last few centuries is populate the world with an increasing amount of hybrids in a kind of proliferation that has never been seen before. Your car, if you have one, and your smartphone, for example, are modern technologies meant to decrease your dependence on nature and to increase your freedom, right? Cars and smartphones both decrease the degree to which you would otherwise be restricted by physical distances. But cars and smartphones are hybrid entities, meaning they exist as they do by virtue of enormous networks that include technological, economic, physical, legal, and mental entities. The same is true for every other piece of equipment you can imagine, including pieces of equipment in scientific laboratories, with such equipment ceaselessly proliferating precisely because of the modern desire to know things themselves. And for Latour, such an example illustrates what is universally the case in our world. Wherever we moderns try to maximize our knowledge of nature in itself, or wherever we try to maximize our own freedom, we instead produce a never-ending stream of hybrid entities. And that brings me to the second part of the talk. If the world does not consist of pure objects or pure subjects, then what is it made of? How to conceptualize these hybrids? And Latour's answer is that reality consists of actors or actants, with actors being entities that are just as social as us subjects, that the moderns take to inhabit the domain of culture, and just as real as the objects that the moderns take to constitute nature. Unlike objects and subjects, however, actors are not a priori restricted to a single domain of reality. Unlike the objects cherished by the moderns, they do not behave. They also act, meaning that each actor adds its own difference to reality. And unlike the modern subject, actors do not just entertain social relations with others of their kind, but with heterogeneous sets of other actors. In short, actors are socially constructed entities, but not in the usual sense, right? Usually, when we say that something is socially constructed, we mean that it's just socially constructed. And we mean that it has been thought up by humans and that it only exists by virtue of humans, who keep thinking about it. In the usual sense, if you say that God is a social construct, you mean that God only exists insofar as human beings think he exists. Just like the price of a pair of rare sneakers is usually taken as a social construct if you think that it only has that value to the extent that we believe that it's worth 300 euros or something. That is not the sense in which actors are socially constructed according to Latour. For Latour, to be socially constructed means that an actor exists because of an entire host of other actors, and this host does not just include humans and our thoughts, but also non-humans, such as laws, chemicals, buildings, organisms, minerals, theories, and so on. And up to this point, this notion of actors sounds similar to the Deleuzian machines that we discussed in the previous lecture, if you were there. And there are indeed many points of overlap. One major difference, however, is that whereas Deleuzian machines have this transcendental, non-actual aspect, as we saw, the powers of machines which need not be manifest all the time, Latourian actors are always fully actual, fully deployed. They hold nothing in reserves. An actor has no hidden transcendental principle, which for Latour therefore means that an actor does not have powers or potentials in and of itself. As he puts it in Pandora's Hope, and I quote, "There is no other way to define an actor but through its action. And there is no other way to define an action but by asking what other actors are modified, transformed, perturbed, or created by the character that is the focus of attention." And from that definition of actors, almost everything else follows. Latourian actors have 4 features that I would like to highlight here, and the names for these features are association, trials, translation, and black boxing. Incidentally, in this I largely follow what Graham Harman often identifies as the key components of Latour's ontology. So first, associations. In line with the definition I just quoted, an actor is what it is and does what it does only because of its relations to other entities, to other actors. They do not have any properties in and of themselves, because everything must be bestowed upon them, donated to them by others. Simply put, water only exists insofar as hydrogen and oxygen maintain the appropriate bonds. Just like a building only exists insofar as mortar, brick, glass, and wood maintain a certain composition. The same is true for entire societies. Society does not just consist of human social relations, compounded in a social contract, but of countless economic, religious, legal, technological, physical, organic, ideal, and so on actors that shape our collective lives in their mutual associations. So that's association. Second is trials of strength. If an actor, because it has no properties in and of itself, is to persist across time, other actors that supply it with qualities or even existence need to be kept in line, right? Need to keep doing what they do. They need to be kept in line as the parts that constitute an actor or as the habitat that allows for its persistence. But since no actor, or at least for Latour, naturally has any particular kind of function or place, the resulting picture of reality is a gigantic game of pull and push. Push and pull? Or as Latour puts it, a reality where trials of strength are ubiquitous. Ontologically, and interestingly, I think, this means that whether or not something exists in the first place is not a binary affair of either it exists or it does not, but a matter of degree. The more actors become allied or subjected to a certain actor, the more reality it will have. Almost like a rock or a pebble that snowballs down a mountain and gathers up more material as it goes, actors are real to the degree that they make their weight felt in the world. But again, you should not understand that as a case of blasé postmodern relativism. Right? If, for example, the conspiracy theory that takes the Earth to be flat were to gain exponentially more adherents, the Latourian view is of course not committed to saying that the Earth itself thereby becomes more and more flat. That would be ridiculous. The Latourian view would only be committed to saying that the more allies flat earth theory gains, the more it becomes a reality that other actors in the world will be forced to deal with, whether they like it or not, whether they agree with it or not. In other words, actors are real to the extent that they extend themselves into a relevant network where they manage to resonate, or more crudely, force their existence upon others. And the COVID pandemic is also a good example. In the Latourian view, the more the virus infected more and more human bodies, the more it forced all kinds of economic, legal, pharmaceutical, and political actors to respond to it, to alter their own course as a response to it, the more reality it gained, precisely because it managed to massively increase the amount of the world that it perturbed, altered, created, or destroyed. So you get this quantitative idea of reality. So actors are defined by associations, by trials, and thirdly, by translation. According to Latour, no actor is ever just a representation of some other actor. No actor is just an intermediary, as he calls it, that simply functions as a frictionless conduit for the actions of some other entity. Instead, all actors are mediators, and a mediator is something that adds its own difference once made to act. And that is what makes an actor irreducible, despite the fact that it owes its entire existence to others. This principle of translation is completely obvious in human affairs, right? We all know that leaders cannot give orders without their subordinates interpreting them in their own way, or that you can never write a book without your readers interpreting it differently than how you intend it. But for Latour, this is true across the board, also among non-humans. To take an example from my own country, in the Netherlands, large-scale industrial activity has led to higher nitrogen levels in the soil. This makes the soil more acidic, causing calcium to dissolve. One biologist in the back, yes, causing calcium to dissolve. This leads to a calcium shortage in the diet of several species of birds, causing their bones to be so brittle that chicks break their legs as soon as they hatch. So the brittle bones, on the Latourian view, of these birds translate the calcium levels in their habitat, which in turn translate the presence of nitrogen and so on. But crucially, at each point of translation, we find a newly affected actor that starts adding its own difference to the world. And according to Latour, to talk about translation in this way is decidedly not modern. The moderns allow only for a single gap where interpretation and translation happens, and that's the gap between objects and subjects, right? Subjects, that humans that interpret the world. According to the moderns, that is only our prerogative, and this single gap between humans and things has been the obsessive focus of philosophers ever since Descartes, Hume, and especially Kant. Yet for Latour, in what you could call a kind of generalized hermeneutics, the modern gap between humans and things is just one among many such gaps, with translation happening everywhere, not just between people and things, but also between non-humans. Just like this lecture is a better or worse translation of Latour's writings, the body of a horse is a translation of the grass that feeds it, and a mountain is a translation of rain, wind, and tectonic activity. Fourth and finally, and then we have the basic features of actors well in view, actors can become what Latour calls black boxes. A black box is an actor that you can engage with without having to deal with the turbulence of the entire network of other actors that brings it about and maintains its existence. So your smartphone is a black box, because most of the time you can use it without paying attention to its physical or digital architecture, let alone the entire chain of industrial production and its associated legal, economic, and political elements. Right? And the interesting thing about this black box phenomenon is that it explains, as far as Latour is concerned, why we tend to ascribe powers or potentials to certain actors. which he holds is a mistake, right? For him, actors don't have powers or potentials, they just do what they do. A clear example is how in everyday speech we tend to talk about political leaders as if they personally have power. The Latourian point is that they do not have that power in a metaphysical sense, meaning as some property that they magically possess in and of themselves. Instead, a politician only has power to the extent that people are willing to obey, to the extent that this politician is backed by the law, by police, and by the armed forces, to the extent that their secretaries keep putting them in contact with colleagues and lobbyists, to the extent that communications networks, so telephones, email traffic, and so on, function properly to relay their decisions, and so on. In short, power is not a property of the politician that wields it, but a property of the associations, of the relations that the politician entertains with other humans and non-humans. Or as Latour puts it at times, the ostensible strength of an actor can always be revealed as actually being a tiered array of weaknesses, namely as vulnerable relations with other actors that currently happen to function in a supportive role, but do not necessarily need to maintain that role. So actors are defined by associations, by trials of strength, by translation, and by a certain tendency or possibility of becoming black boxes. And that brings me to the second part of actor network theory, the networks. Latourian actors exist in networks, but these are quite unlike how we usually visualize networks as a bunch of dots with lines connecting them to each other, right? Many things are wrong with that picture. So this is the standard picture of a network that we're going to disagree with. Right? It's this idea that you have a bunch of nodes with certain connections between them, right? And that's a wrong view of things. First, because the picture suggests that things, entities, so the dots in the picture, remain identical, i.e. the same dots, as they are affected by others. This violates the definition of actors, which are their relational engagements and hence change their nature when others start to affect them. Second, the lines between the dots suggest that information or material can be sent from A to B without any kind of distortion, which violates the principle of translation. Third, the entire picture suggests that networks are always stable structures, whereas from a Latourian perspective, such stability is at best a temporary achievement. And finally, the open space beyond or behind the lines and the dots suggests that networks would exist against the background of something that is not itself a network, whereas for Latour, actors and networks are all there is. So what's a better example? To answer the question of what a network would really be, it's always best to look at concrete cases. In Latour's famous book, The Pasteurization of France, about Pasteur's discovery of microorganisms, provides a good example. Pasteur's work on microorganisms has them do things that have never been done before. His laboratory work makes them visible to the naked eye for the first time in history. His procedures isolate them and open them up to manipulation, ultimately processing them into vaccines and serums. In addition, microorganisms start adding new elements to society, for example, a vector of contagion between people, which now engenders new social divisions between the healthy and the sick. As also beautifully described in Latour's study, doctors, surgeons, and countless other professionals alter their self-definitions, their alliances, their hostilities, and their practices in light of emerging knowledge about microorganisms. But this is not a case of one-way traffic in which all the force, so to speak, is exercised by a single actor, for example, the microorganisms, on a host of obedient others that simply fall in line. A bunch of microscopic life in a petri dish is in and of itself too laughably weak to alter the structure of entire societies. What we have instead is a world full of various actors that end up in a network where, through all kinds of mishmashed controversies, associations, and trials of strength, all those involved define and redefine each other, without any single actor being identifiable as some kind of overarching force or master term that orchestrates the entire show. And if you've ever partaken in bottom-up political activism, where everything still has to be decided on, then you also know what Latour means by a network, right? If you're in a political association that is just getting started, then you know that there are no stable definitions, there are no memberships. Every aspect of your network, from the axioms that you think you will operate on to who you think your allies are to the space where you convene, can change because of any other point in that network changing, right? It's only later when things have institutionalized that we start thinking differently about the world. But Latour is very much interested in the world under construction and not the world as it has been constructed. So, that's, back to the Pasteur example, that's one of the reasons why Latour thinks it is far too reductive and simply wrong to say that Pasteur just discovers microorganisms. Instead, he prefers to say Pasteur and the many humans and non-humans with which he is associated produce microorganisms that in turn help produce a wide variety of new entities and social relations among countless actors. In short, what the network part of actor network theory seeks to stress is that the world is not some kind of book of nature whose pages we simply uncover one after the other simply by reading ever onwards in an objective and disinterested way. The world is much more like a giant factory in which actors, through all kinds of translations and feedback loops, co-produce the very things that produce them. And that brings me to the third and final part of the talk, which concerns ecology. Because what difference does it make to think about the world in terms of actors and networks? What can we do, or at least see, that we cannot do or see properly as long as we remain modern? Well, starting in the late 90s, with the publication of his book, Politics of Nature, Latour increasingly turned his attention towards ecological concerns, and ecology is precisely where an actor-network way of thinking can clearly make a difference. Because modernity has left us with a rather quaint idea of nature. Nature is something that starts just outside of our cities and villages, just to the left and right of our roads, where asphalt gives way to grasses and weeds. Nature is what is traversed by airplanes and submarines, yet despite their full immersion in it, they do not count as part of it. According to the moderns, if you have a forest with a certain, let's say, deer population, plus a factory right next to it, then the relations between the deer population and the forest is somehow more intimate or indeed more natural than the relations between the factory and the forest. So if certain vegetation disappears because of grazing deer, we call this natural, undesirable perhaps, but still natural. If vegetation disappears because of the factory's emissions, this is seen as artificial, as belonging to that other modern domain. That's a very strange way of thinking, if only for the fact that in my country, almost the entire deer population, and certainly the entire wild pig population, and many species of birds that we have in the forests where I grew up, were all deliberately imported from Germany and Eastern Europe centuries ago. So their so-called natural presence in the woods is just as artificial as the presence of the factory near the woods. Yet modernity gives us this idea that relations among creatures and things in the domain of nature are somehow different in kind from relations between those things in nature and our social relations and cultural artifacts. And this gives rise to the idea that nature as a separate domain is one distinct concern among many others. That's going to be the problem here. So on the modern view, nature is something to be taken into account alongside things such as the economy, foreign affairs, public health, industrial development, and so on. It also gives rise to the idea that nature is best served by leaving it to its own devices. Again, because relations between, for example, deer and forests would somehow be more natural and hence more proper than relations between factories and forests, or solar panels and forests, if you want, right? Hence, the modern worldview tends towards the idea that in order to protect nature, we ought to widen the gap between nature and culture and minimize our trespassing, so to speak. And Latour, of course, disagrees with such a modern view, if only for the fact that all attempts at letting nature be, at rewilding the wild, at creating spaces where humans do not trespass, invariably require enormous amounts of human artifice, including political decision-making, legislation, activism, surveillance, scientific measurements, wildlife services, infrastructural arrangements, and so on. This ironic fact alone should suffice to show that there is something wrong with the modern view of ecology. Alternatively, from an actor network perspective, all relations between so-called natural entities and so-called cultural artifacts are, or at least start off, on equal footing. That does not mean they are all equally valuable. It also does not mean that they are all equally good or bad or even real. It simply means that they are, in principle, not divided in an a priori way into separate domains, right? Not into two halves that are each their own ontological territory. So there is not first some harmonious background entity called nature, which is then disturbed and thrown off course by devious creatures like ourselves. Latour likes to remind us that even our very air, the air that we breathe, is only rich in oxygen because of how certain bacteria started emitting it into the atmosphere billions of years ago. The lesson to be learned from this example is that our entire world has always already been shaped by the contingent actions of living as well as non-living entities. The entire world is thus pervasively characterized by artifice. So instead of thinking in terms of nature, separate domain over there, Latour proposes to finally really start thinking in terms of ecology. Ecology is not one domain alongside others, alongside politics, sports, and economics. Ecology includes everything. Real ecological thinking does not have much interest in determining which entities and relations are natural or which are not. Instead, it is concerned with tracing the actors relevant to specific networks, which is to say, specific ecosystems. But when we say something like ecosystem, the Latourian view asks us to not limit any given such system to just flora and fauna. Instead of having ecologies stop once they touch the border of your cities, industries, and highways, actor network theories ask us to continue tracing the relations between actors regardless of whether they are songbirds, skyscrapers, nitrogen emissions, railroads, or tectonic plates. And one could say, are we not already doing this? Are we not living in the Anthropocene, the age in which we have all finally realized that nature is not some kind of background that exists yonder in discontinuity with our industrial and agricultural affairs? Have we not started to already acknowledge that instead of simply distinguishing between nature and culture, the world consists of complicated systems full of feedback loops? And in a sense, it would be correct to say that. But one should also acknowledge that such a view of the world does not emerge spontaneously, and that Latour for decades now has been one of those authors whose concepts are sources that help us realize that the world is such, right? That the world has this specific ecological reality to it. Latour's work also helps us understand that modern thinking is so deeply ingrained in how our world is organized that a merely theoretical change of mind is not enough. Many other things will have to change if we are to replace a modern way of thinking with a more ecological, which is to say realistic view of the world. And by way of concluding the lecture and to illustrate some of the challenges when making that shift, let me just paraphrase 3 examples of such required changes that Latour discusses in recent works. I teach rhetoric, where one of the rules is that you never end on an enumeration, but here we go. The first example concerns our habitual way of visualizing the world. By far the most common image of our world is the map of the globe, where nations, mountains, rivers, and oceans are neatly arranged side by side. And there is, of course, nothing wrong with that image in principle. The Netherlands really is located to the west of Germany, just like Malta really is located to the south of Sicily. The problem lies with what the image misses, what it neglects. It disregards that in terms of actor networks, which is to say in terms of dependency relations, one might often have far more intensive relations with entities that are physically much more distant than one's direct neighbors. And our go-to visualization of the world can scarcely accommodate this. Can scarcely accommodate that the Netherlands, for example, is much closer to Bangladesh than Germany when it comes to the fashion industry. Just like it is closer to Brazil than Belgium when it comes to livestock feed. And if we want to learn to think ecologically, we also need to learn to imagine our planet ecologically. The question then is, how do you visualize these vast networks of shifting mutual dependencies? An added dimension of this challenge is the fact that these images are different in each case. They don't neatly come together in one single globe where everything is neatly arranged side to side, because the actor network of the global fashion industry looks very different from the actor network of the agricultural sector. This is maddeningly complex compared to that one trusted old image, right, of the blue planet where everything is neatly arranged side by side. In other words, actor network theory confronts us with a pressing aesthetic challenge concerning our ecological imagination. That's visualization. The second example concerns our institutional approach to the world. As already mentioned, much of our world has been organized around modern principles. Universities have faculties for the natural sciences here, faculties for the humanities there. And the two rarely interact. Governments have ministries for foreign affairs, domestic affairs, the economy, and agriculture, and then they also have a ministry for the environment and for nature, as if such a thing really exists. In the Netherlands, it's even more ridiculous because we have one ministry for agriculture and nature, and then we have another ministry for the economy and the climate. So apparently there's a thing called nature that you can serve and protect without the climate coming into the picture and so on. It's terrible. The recent pandemic has taught us once and for all that the entities of this world are not inclined to respect these artificial categorizations, just like it taught us that scientists, politicians, the media, the healthcare sector, and many other institutional actors still have great trouble when it comes to being forced to operate in an interdisciplinary and more compositional way. Right? It must have been the same all over the world, but very striking, or at least what I found very striking in the Netherlands, is that you would see politicians on television and interviews being asked a question and saying, no, that's not a political question, that is a scientific question. And then in the next interview, when a scientist is asked the exact same thing, saying, well, that's not really what we do, that's a political question and not a scientific question. The Latourian view is, of course, if an entity such as a pandemic, and if you don't like the word entity, then use event. So if an event such as a pandemic really is this kind of a hybrid occurrence in the world, then of course it's never going to be pure enough for anyone to say, oh, this is just a scientific thing or just a political thing. So everybody's going to be confused as to how do you carve this up in such a way that everyone can neatly get their own little disciplinary thing, right? So, from an actor network perspective, the challenge here can be phrased as follows. How can you become more actor-oriented or object-oriented in your dealings with the world, rather than always already having your world cut up into certain domains? And good examples might be found in fields like gender studies or conflict studies, because each of these works to trace, to describe a certain kind of actor, right? Gender conflict, without having strong a priori commitments about which kinds of disciplines, methods, equipment, or descriptions are needed to understand that actor. Instead, the field of gender studies draws on biology and anthropology and phenomenology and politics and personal accounts and so on. They are prepared to mobilize almost everything if it helps them trace gender. Likewise, the field of conflict studies draws on political theory and military science and statistics and religious studies and communication theory, etc. Ecologically speaking, much can still be learned from such approaches, right? Because they are not first disciplinary and then have to go through a lot of trouble to organize themselves in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way. They simply accept that some objects in this world are worth tracing, and without any a priori commitments to what kind of methods you need for that. The third and final example concerns what we view as our task in this world. For the moderns, if you are modern, then your task in this world is to continue globalizing and modernizing, to perpetually make progress. It is to turn the world into one giant open space where information, capital, physical goods, and persons can move without encountering obstacles or friction. It is to turn our planet, which is full of stubborn mediators, into a smooth plain populated by mere intermediaries. This modern dream is being shattered as we speak. Or as Latour puts it, the modern's front of progress is increasingly being revealed as a front of destruction. But we can also not go back to being anti-modern. We cannot return to the localisms and nationalisms of yesteryear simply because ecological actors do not care about your local identity or national boundary. Air pollution, river flows, bird migrations, oceanic plastics, droughts, and sea levels do not respect those kinds of borders. Again, this poses a challenge. The question is, what is the shape, what is the composition of a third kind of world going to be? A third kind of alternative that is neither the unified and globalized planet of the moderns, nor the anti-modern retreat into the fiction of an isolated locality. How do you imagine the sciences, the politics, the economies, and the human inhabitants of such a third kind of world? And the answer that we give, or the answers that we give to these kinds of ecological questions will determine our collective fates. And I, for one, am confident that for decades to come, Latour's work will remain a rich source of insight and inspiration for anyone who seeks to answer them. Thank you very much.